It's 1982. Kids and adults alike are loving video games, playing them both in the arcade and at home. The gaming industry as a whole is worth over $2.5 billion. The market is flushed with tons of different home consoles as well as huge software libraries for each system. Every electronics company and their mother was trying to break into the gaming world like Atari had done in the 1970s, but only a few had succeeded. To say that the market was oversaturated with video games is the understatement of the century, but though this was the case, it wasn't stopping the people from buying them. Therefore, companies had no incentive to cut back on the amount of software and hardware they were producing. Pac-Man was the most popular arcade game of 1980 and 1981, and it made perfect sense to port it over to the home consoles. In their mind, Atari had taken a huge step towards gaining a monopoly on the home console market when they secured exclusive rights to produce Pac-Man for their 2600 system. A developer named Todd Fry was put in charge of development of the game, but large bumps in the road would ensue for him as he tried to port the game over. A huge issue was the massive difference in hardware between the Atari 2600 and the original arcade machine. In essentials, the Atari 2600 had less than 1/10 of the memory and 1/16 of the RAM, so development would be very slow and limited for Fry. He had a prototype available by September of 1981, and company executives wanted to release it right then, in its unreleased state, to capitalize on the 1981 holiday season. Ultimately though, the idea was shelved so Todd Fry could finish the game. Atari took a huge risk with the release of the game. They decided to release 12 million copies of Pac-Man. The 12 million copies was more than the 10 million consoles sold. They justified this by believing that almost everyone who owned an Atari 2600 would go out and buy Pac-Man, while others would buy the system to play it. This decision is now noted as the single stupidest supply versus demand theory in all of video gaming. It's rumored that Atari's marketing manager informed the CEO that even enthusiasts of Pac-Man would not play it on the Atari 2600 due to its look and differences between the versions. Ultimately though, his opinion was dismissed. When it was released in early 1982, Pac-Man was met with commercial success, eventually going on to be the highest-selling Atari 2600 game of all time. However, it sold only 7 million units, which is just little over half of the original 12 million production. Though it is the highest-selling game on the system, Pac-Man is often regarded as a very poor game. It just goes to show that tons of marketing and high sales do not a good game make. Now let's take a break from the video gaming world and talk a bit about the highest grossing film of the 1980s, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Though no one could have known it when it was released in the summer of 1982, E.T. would eventually lead to one of the biggest industry crashes in the history of the United States. On a $10 million budget, E.T. went on to gross almost $793 million worldwide. People fell in love with the heartwarming story of Boy and Alien and practically threw their money at E.T., buying toys and merchandise. As of 1982, E.T. was the top-grossing film of all time. It was huge. That's when Atari had an idea that must have seemed genius to them. Atari was going to develop an E.T. the Extraterrestrial video game. Negotiations began between Atari and Universal Pictures, and by the end of July, Atari had secured the exclusive rights to produce an E.T. video game to the tune of $20 million. Mind you, this was the first time a video game was ever based off of a film, which is now commonplace, but back then it was a make-it-or-break-it situation. After the high sales but lukewarm performance of Pac-Man for Atari 2600, Atari was again more concerned with high profits and becoming the name in video gaming than actually putting out quality games. Howard Scott Warshaw was put in charge of the E.T. adaptation in late July. There was one big issue though. Atari needed to have the game available by the 1982 holiday season, believing it would maximize the profit. Therefore, Warshaw would have to have the game completed in only 5 weeks. It usually took 3 to 6 months for the development of an average Atari game. Warshaw created a concept that was actually somewhat ambitious after just a few days. It It would be a game with objective. E.T. would need to collect pieces of a telephone while avoiding agents in order to be transported home. Upon being presented the idea, however, Universal and Steven Spielberg thought the game should be simplified to a Pac-Man type of game. Atari thought this wouldn't fly though, since they had put up lawsuits against other companies throughout 1982 who made Pac-Man clones for their systems when Atari had exclusive rights to the property, and therefore they thought it would be hypocritical to do so. Therefore, Warshaw continued with his vision, and by September 1st of that year, the game was completed. The game was released in the holiday season of 1982 with a production of roughly 5 million units. Through the season, more than 1 million were sold, but as with Pac-Man, Atari had grossly overestimated the supply of cartridges. Also congruent to Pac-Man was the extremely dismal reception of the game. Critics called it incomplete and a waste of time and money. Consumers began returning the game to stores in massive quantities, seeing as the game was $50 when it was released. By the time it was all said and done, the game had sold 1.5 million copies of a roughly 5 million production run, leaving over 3 million copies unsold. E.T. is now noted as the worst video game ever created by many. In 1983, it is rumored that Atari put millions of unsold and returned copies of both Pac-Man and E.T. into a New Mexico landfill and buried them. Though it is still unknown as to whether the scope of this is true, it is almost an undeniable fact that Atari has put software in a landfill in some shape or form. Atari, who thought they would be kings of the video game market after the release of Pac-Man and E.T., were now burying the games. In a sense, the whole video game market was getting buried. 1982 also saw an unprecedented advancement in computer technology. The Commodore 64 debuted in 1982 with capabilities that home consoles just couldn't compete with. Though it had a heavy price tag of almost $600 upon its debut, it soon became synonymous with computer gaming. The Commodore 64 wasn't just a gaming machine though, it was also a developmental tool and even a home office machine. Through its lifetime, over 10,000 commercial pieces of software were compatible with the Commodore 64. Computer gaming sort of began with this system and is still popular today. Throughout the 1980s, though the home console game market fell, the home computer grew into something much bigger. In 1983, Commodore offered a trade-in deal that would go towards lowering the price of the expensive Commodore 64. The offer was to trade in your Atari 2600 and get money off one of them. Commodore quipped, "When your children go to college, they're going to need a computer, not a video game system." The Commodore 64, though considered a gaming machine, never experienced any fallout from the market crash due to the simple fact that it held its own as a home computer. There are several other factors that led to the demise of the home video game market, a huge one being quality control. As seen previously, Atari didn't even really stipulate quality control on two of its highest profile games, so you can imagine how third-party publishers felt when they were building games. The common philosophy was just put something out there that you think people will buy, which is somewhat of a good strategy, but people don't like to be deceived. If you deceive them, they aren't going to buy any more games. Companies would often trick consumers by having lavish game box art and then featuring screenshots from an arcade game, or not showing any screenshots at all. Consumers were misinformed, and shoveling out $50 to $70 for a game just didn't make sense to them. What was worse is that when a consumer was informed as to what a game should be, such as Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, they ended up getting something completely and utterly different. The market was so flooded with video games that many retailers didn't even have the shelf space to carry new games and consoles. Consumer interest lowered and slowed after 1983. Many companies such as Coleco and Magnavox left the video game industry altogether due to the lowered value in them. Retailers stopped carrying games and even began trying to return the product to developers because they couldn't sell it. The developers were bleeding so much money that they couldn't even reimburse. Therefore, retailers felt betrayed. My, how the mighty had fallen. Atari, in an ill-fated move, even tried to release another home console in 1984 called the Atari 7800, but consumers just didn't trust Atari anymore. One common misconception about the video game market crash is that it was just as bad for consumers as it was for retailers and publishers. Though consumers were deceived by companies, the lowered interest caused a lower price point for video games too. Some retailers decreased the cost of a product as much as 99% off just to clear their inventory. Consumers could get games valued at $60 for under $1. Dedicated gamers could get several games at unbelievably low prices, which is good in a sense, but for the retailer it left an immensely sour taste in their mouths. Losing that much money is never good, and many outlets never even wanted to hear the words video game again. The only company who really endured the home market crash was Atari, and in a sense, they indirectly caused it. Just to give you an idea as to how large the video game market crash of 1983 was, well, revenues peaked at $3.2 billion in 1983, and by the end of 1985, revenues were just $100 million. That's a drop of more than 96%. The arcade scene was still out and about, but home gaming was practically dead.